Hey guys, this is Scott with Truth Uncovered, and I want to thank you for joining me again for another one of our 10 Minutes in Acts video teachings. The last video, we kind of went through the first part of Acts chapter 1 rather quickly. I said we were going to come back and touch on some things. But I want us to look at near the end of chapter 1. Acts chapter 1, let's start at verse 10. It says, "And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven, as he went up, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel, which also said, Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Yeshua, which is taken up from you into heaven, shall also come in like manner as ye have seen him go into heaven." One of the things I want us to focus on here is these men in white apparel said this same Yeshua. This is important for us to understand because much of Christianity wants to Christianize Jesus. They want you to think that he uh, left all of the Hebraic practices uh, that we find in the Bible, that much of the Christian world will call Jewish. And we talked a little bit about this in our first video, the Leviticus 23. Those feast days are not Jewish feast days. They are, as it says in Leviticus 23, God says they are his feast days, and he commanded his people to keep those feast days. So when it says this same Jesus, let me try to help you understand that whatever Jesus practiced while on earth, he's going to continue to practice that. And we'll look at that later on. But we saw in the first part where Luke says in verse 1, he says, of all that Yeshua began both to do and to teach. Well, that word to do, as we said earlier, means to keep, to celebrate. And the word teach means to impart instruction, instill doctrine. I'm going to go a little bit further than that another time when we have more time. But I want us to look at something just real quickly. And let's go on down to verse 12. It says, Then returned they unto Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is from Jerusalem a Sabbath day journey. You see, Yeshua, Jesus, ascended from the Mount of Olives. And I'm going to touch on this in this video because there is a teaching that is out there. And there are men that teach that Yeshua, Jesus, was just the son of Joseph, and he was the literal son of Joseph. There are some that teach that he was a sinner, and that Yeshua was not divine in any way because he was the son of Joseph. But let's look and see what the Bible says and who the Bible tells us that Yeshua is. You may say, what's it got to do with the book of Acts? Everything. Because we're looking here in this verse that says he ascended from the Mount of Olivet. Let's go to Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 4. Well, let's begin at verse 1. It says, Behold, the day of Yahweh, God, cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. So we're talking about the day of the Lord, the day of Yahweh, the day of God, the day when he returns. Verse 4 says, And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem, on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south. Okay, whose feet here in Zechariah are they talking about landing on the Mount of Olives? They're talking about the feet of God. Well, what did these men, these angels that stood by the disciples that day as Yeshua ascended up into heaven, they were on the Mount of Olives, and what did the men say? This same Jesus shall return just like you're seeing him leave. So Jesus is the one whose feet are going to land on the Mount of Olives. Well, Zechariah says that it is God. God's feet are going to land on the Mount of Olives. So it's got to be, God and Jesus have to be the same person. Let's go to Zechariah chapter 10, chapter 12, in verse 10. Zechariah 12 and 10 says, And I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, and they shall look upon me. Let's define who the me is. Who is speaking? Yahweh. God is speaking when he says they shall look upon me. They're going to look at me, whom they have pierced. And they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness of his firstborn. So here again, we see, we got to just stop and let's just think about this. God says they're going to look upon me, whom they have pierced. When did anybody pierce God? Yeshua, Jesus, is the one that was pierced. So who are we going to be looking at? Yeshua. But here again in Zechariah, Zechariah is penning the words as God's giving him, and God says they're going to look upon me. They're going to look upon me, whom they have pierced. So in this 10-minute book, 10-minute Acts, 10 minutes in the book of Acts, we have established that Yeshua, this same Yeshua, not a different one, he's not going to hold different practices when Yeshua comes back. He's not going to keep modern Christian practices. He is going to keep the feast days. And let me show you that. Zechariah 14 and 16. Zechariah 14 and 16. And it shall come to pass that everyone that is left, this is after a great battle, when Jesus returns, of all the nations which came against Jerusalem, shall even go up from year to year to worship the King Yahweh of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. If you remember, we've just come through this feast. I said during this time that this is a rehearsal. It's a rehearsal. Paul says it this way, it's a shadow, these feasts, these Sabbaths, these new moons, they are a shadow of things to come. And Zechariah tells us during this millennial kingdom, this kingdom where we're no longer tempted by the adversary, the devil. Everything is perfect. We're learning, we're teaching the ways of God. That everyone that is left shall come up year after year and keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Verse 17, and it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King Yahweh of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain. When we were beginning Tabernacles, I made a short video, it might be on our Truth Uncovered Facebook page, talking about Tabernacles was a celebration of the rain. So Zechariah is telling us, if you don't come and celebrate Tabernacles, if you don't come up to Jerusalem for Tabernacles during this time, you shall have no rain. So this same Jesus, we're going a little bit past 10 minutes again, this same Jesus, we have to understand, it is important that we understand that Yeshua did not become Christian. And understandable that we are taught that Christian means Christ-like. In the culture that the Bible, that the New Testament was written in, Christian was a derogatory term. It was not a boast or anything. It was a derogatory term. We need to also understand that when Christianity first began, if we're going to use Christianity, when it first began, it was part of Judaism. The believers went to synagogue. Maybe in our next video we'll jump ahead, maybe, and look at Acts 10. But the point of this video is that this same Jesus, and that Jesus is God. Until next time, shalom.